Okay, I'll start then. I'll introduce myself to the people that do not know me. My name is Marco Falchieri. I'm the veterinary lead in avian virology at the National Reference Lab at Weybridge. And I'm going to give you an overview regarding the surveillance activities that we carry out within the agency and involving particularly the National Reference Lab in the wild bird space, particularly in GB. So, sorry, I think I'm having a few issues in changing page. Okay, I think you can see it now. So I'm just going to give you a bit of a background for those of you that are not familiar with avian influenza, but basically, historically, avian influenza incursions in the British Isles have always followed the migration of wild anatids from their breeding site in Siberia toward the European continent and the British Isles. And normally these migrations start in autumn, and these birds stay over winter, and they normally go back to Russia basically in spring. And outbreaks in poultry have always followed these patterns. And to be fair, since October 2021, as a country, we've been quite lucky compared to other neighboring countries, because prior to autumn 2021, we had, the maximum cases that we had was 13, 16, 17. And actually in 2021, we had 26 in total. However, since October 2021, we've had one single continuous outbreak that is still ongoing, with a total of 364 cases in a span of 2 years. So that's a big change in pattern. So why do we need to monitor wild birds on the eye side? Well, it's because wild birds are primary hosts of avian influenza viruses. Some of them are reservoir of these viruses. They maintain them, they carry them during their migration, and obviously they transmit them to other birds and potentially also, particularly for certain strains, to other mammalian hosts, including human. So it is thought that all avian species are susceptible to a certain degree to avian influenza, but obviously this susceptibility will vary depending on birds' order and species. And if you look in the more in the specific, wild anatids and charaidriforms are, the historical reservoir of these viruses. And it's important on our side to monitor the incursions in wild birds, because obviously that would allow us to potentially predict the risk to poultry farms, but also to look at the viral evolution, and that there are also some conservation, there is an interest on the conservation side, because obviously these viruses can, not always, but these viruses can be deadly. So in APHA, we run a passive wild bird surveillance scheme that basically involves testing of carcasses. It works by basically a member of the public would report must die off either to the DEFRA helpline or through the newly developed online gov.uk system. And obviously this report then will be passed and triaged within either by the online system or by our courier. And depending if they meet certain criteria, a collection would be triggered. Once the carcasses are collected, they normally are delivered to regional labs. Their samples are collected and sent to the lab, to the National Reference Lab for testing. So it is a scanning passive surveillance on wild bird population, and this was originally created to advise on risk on poultry. And this is very important because it wasn't originally designed to basically take into account the conservation repercussion. However, in a marginal way, also answer some of our conservation questions. Before I mention about the criteria for collection, because it's not feasible for us to collect every single carcass. So there are some criteria that basically are based on different categories. We divide our birds in three categories. One is birds of prey because of their ethology and behavior. These are not birds that are very gregarious. And then also we divide the rest of the bird as target species, such as normally swans, ducks, geese, and gulls, which are known to be highly susceptible to these viruses, and all the others that are considered non-target species. So obviously, depending on how many carcasses are found at the same spot, and depending on the thresholds that are agreed within APHA and other stakeholders, these are normally agreed actually at ADPG. This threshold can vary, but I've just put on these slides a few examples, and particularly these are thresholds that we would normally use in peacetime, such as, and this would be 1 or more dead birds of prey, or 3 or more for target species, and 5 or more for non-target species. So just a few numbers to give you an idea of the scale of the ask. This is a dashboard that has been developed by, it's a picture of the dashboard that has been developed by some of our APHA and DEFRA colleagues. And as you can see, since April 2023, we had more than 50,000 collection requests. And if you look on a daily basis, we are talking about more than 100 requests per day. So why it is important? What do we use this data for? So these data are important in order to inform the relevant colleagues and agencies such as policy and CBOs on the risk that incursion in wild birds represent to the poultry industry. So we know when we assess the risk, and we normally have weekly meetings on this, we normally take into consideration two categories, poultry and wild birds. At the moment, the risk in wild birds is high, and in poultry is low. And obviously, the risk is assessed on the basis of our wild bird surveillance, but also on the data from the outbreak and data from other countries, and at times also data from the genomic that we get from our surveillance activities. So going back to our operational side, so the wild bird carcasses are normally transported to the closest regional lab, and here samples are collected. We collect normally oropharyngeal and cloacal swabs, and these swabs would be then be sent to the national reference lab. Now, due to SAPO4 requirements and the type of virus we are dealing with, when there is suspicion of disease, a full PM is not allowed, and that's why we collect these mucosal swabs. And then following the results, if negative, further investigation will be done, including obviously a full postmortem examination. There are other streams through which we get samples, and in this case, we normally get them directly to Weybridge. There is another scheme that is the Warden Patrol scheme led by WWT, which involves about 10 sites across GB. And they are normally, WWT are allowed to send to us any samples from any dead bird without, there are no thresholds applied, so they do not have to take into account those thresholds. And more recently, because of the scale of the epizootic, we've also been engaging with several NGOs and other governmental agencies such as Nature Scotland, Natural England, Natural Resource Wales, to get directly samples, particularly from sites that are managed by NGOs. And this has been particularly useful because, as you can understand, the logistical side is quite difficult and challenging. This is particularly useful for when we need to get samples from remote locations such as the islands. So Once we get our samples to the National Reference Lab, they are normally tested with multiple PCR. At the moment, we are running 3 PCR on each sample, and this would include a general influenza A virus PCR. And then we would test for the most prevalent strain, which at the moment is the alipathogenic H5N1. We normally test these birds twice a week. So I'll just go through briefly about on the results that we gathered from these activities. So we tested, since October 2021, we tested more than 7,200 birds, of which 3,300 were positive for alipathogenic H5 viruses. And these positivities included 80 different species, and they were scattered obviously across all the devolved administrations in GB. This is a chart. It's a very interesting chart that basically compare in the cases in poultry and in wild birds. Wild birds are red and poultry, wild birds are blue and poultry are red. And I just want to draw your attention on the 2 peaks that are present. The first one that is at the beginning that is basically in the period autumn and winter. And these are 2 peaks that are present both in poultry and wild birds. And then there is a second, and obviously these peaks are due to the incursions in wild anatids. If you remember at the beginning of the presentation, I mentioned the migration pattern of these birds. Normally, the most prevalent species are grey-leg geese, barnacle geese, mute swans, and Canada geese, and these have been the same both in winter 21-22 and 22-23. And then we had another peak in summer, and again we had it both in summer 2022 and 2023. And this reflects to the shift that the incursion the infection has had in seabirds. And obviously the main species affected varied depending on the season, but included mainly caradriforms, so gulls, auks, and gannets. And this is very important because different populations have represented different risk to the poultry industry itself. So wild anatids are of higher risk because of their ethology, behavior, and obviously because they tend to fly more inland. And also they are very susceptible and this means that they require a lower infectious dose to get actively infected, but also that they shed very well and quite a lot of virus. On the contrary, seabird species are the vast majority are mainly coastal species, so they're less likely to get in contact with poultry. Then we've got other species that are a bit in between, like particularly gulls, herring gulls, and black-headed gulls, because these are considered bridging species because obviously they can be found both on coastal areas and more inland, and obviously they represent a higher risk to poultry than other seabirds. The shift that we've seen for the first time in summer 2022 in seabirds is the first time in this part of the world. And it was totally unexpected, but these explain why we had such a continuous outbreak, because basically this bird, although they are lower risk, they're maintaining the infection in Europe and in GB over summer. So one of the other purposes of our surveillance is the basically monitoring of the virus evolution. So obviously, avian influenza has got several subtypes, and this current most prevalent subtype is the alipathogenic H5N1, as I mentioned before, although we had a few and sporadic detection of other subtypes, where detection in autumn 2021 were H5N8, an alipathogenic H5N8, and then we had also a few detection both in poultry and wild birds of other low path strains such as H6N2, H7N3, H3N1 and recently in H16N3 in gulls. Looking at the current H5N1, we've detected several genotypes. A total of 12 genotypes have been found in GB. However, when we look at the prevalence, both in poultry and wild birds, because the situation is similar, only 3 are basically the main one or the dominant ones. Following the incursion of this particular strain of avian influenza, obviously it is well known in literature that these viruses can also affect potentially mammalian hosts, particularly when there is a strict contact and with an high infectious dose. And we've seen this in GB, and particularly in species that are believed to scavenge on dead carcasses. And we had positives actually in arbor seals, arbor porpoise, common dolphins, otters, foxes, and also gray seals. And following that, we've also set up surveillance activities on the non-avian hosts. And these are actually, I think so far we've tested more than 250 animals. There are other non-statutory surveillance activities that we've carried out so far, but these basically are more either enhanced ad hoc surveillance activities or research activities. I will go through quite quickly, but just to give you an idea on other stream of samples that we normally get. For example, we screened some healthy wild birds using some of the samples that we could gather through the wild fowling activities. And we tested about roughly 400 birds, of which something between 3 and 4% were positive for influenza, for actually highly pathogenic influenza viruses. And these were mainly, the positive one were mainly widgeon steels, mallard ducks, and pink-footed geese. We've also carried out some studies in the environment, particularly in the seabird breeding sites, both in Scotland and in England, in the Farne Islands. We collected a wide range of samples, including carcasses, water, sediment, feathers, fecal material, soil, nesting material. And what we gathered is that this virus, generally speaking, does not persist for long in the environment. For example, in the Farne Island, we could only get the virus, detect the virus in a carcass. Other activities included the monitoring of the immune status of certain populations, and we did this at Bass Rock, on the gannets, and also in the barnacle geese in Scotland. And we could detect some seroconversion in both populations. And obviously this is a good news, considering the fact that some of these populations have been badly affected in basically for the gannets with the summer 2022, but they've not been badly affected in summer 2023. So that means that it's a positive news, because it means that they are developing an anticorpal response which is protective. And I mean, that's all for me, just a few lines. Obviously, these activities, the wild bird surveillance for AI, is very critical to understand how these viruses are moving within this population. It is also very important to consider, and I'm sure all the colleagues that deal with wildlife know that, how difficult it is to gather samples from the wild. There are a lot of unknowns, particularly in regards to the susceptibility of wild bird species, their role, and also the immunological response. And there are quite a few research activities that will take place in the following months and years in this space. And obviously, we're currently looking at ways to improve our surveillance to improve the granularity, improve our knowledge, particularly in regards to species range. And also, particularly DEFRA colleagues and APHA colleagues are also there are a lot of discussions and activities on how we could better use mortality data that we get through the online system, but also directly from NGOs. And there will be, some maps and dashboards that will be made available shortly. And that is all from me. Thank you.